Hello, everyone. Welcome to the December 17th, 2024 Planning Board meeting. As an initial matter, because we are remote, I will do a roll call vote in the order I see people. So Rob Almeida.
Here.
Mark Giddings.
Here.
Linda Miller.
Here.
Abby Flanagan.
Here.
And I, Andrew Boardman, am also here. So with that, we will move on to our first agenda item, which is the draft MBTA community zoning site plan rules and regulations. So we had discussed these last meeting with the consultant, walking us through the previously submitted questions as well as things that were brought up at the time. So it was a fairly exhaustive discussion. The updated rules and regs were distributed. I don't know if anyone else had additional comments or concerns or anything else we needed to discuss at this point. Linda.
I have a couple of points. I read them. I made the mistake of reading them again. Do you want to?
Which is fine. So I can bring it up on my screen, but I did want Andrew to recognize that Sue Felshin has also joined the board.
Well, thank you for that.
So is it easier if I just share my screen, Linda?
Yeah, that would be great. My first comment is on section 5.2. And it says under D, the planning board may adopt design guidelines to provide information to applicants about architectural styles and components, including those from historic and contemporary buildings that are considered valued by the Concord community and suitable for multifamily developments. And so I had two questions. One is, are we going to adopt design guidelines? And then section 5.8 is called site design. And I wanted to make it seemed to me, given that there's nothing that talks about design guidelines, I assume this is not referring to 5.8. Site design is not the same as design guidelines.
Correct.
And do you think I'm the only one who would get confused by that?
If you're confused, then it's a bigger issue. So we could say probably site layout.
That would be great. Then I think that would deal with it. It doesn't deal with the are we planning to create design guidelines, that which is just a general question. Because we say that we may. So I'm just asking Elizabeth, is that like something that 2020 something is on the schedule, or
it has never been discussed by the board? So okay. If that's something you
so I just
want to do, or whether
Andrew
gets
I know that some towns do have design guidelines and all sorts of stuff. I know if we're trying to be more friendly towards property owners, they are usually viewed poorly because they become overly restrictive. But it's not something that we've ever brought up, but it's something that I know it's come up in the West Concord Advisory from time to time, and I know it's come up in other contexts, but it's one of those things that keeping your options open for that is not a terrible idea. But I don't think it's something that anyone's actively like, yes, we have to regulate this.
Okay. I mean,
the other option, you can, adopt these and, the bylaw is implemented and, you may not need them, or you may find you need them. It's kind of hard to tell until it starts to get implemented, I think.
Okay. Then the second question I had was under 5.4.g. And this I found confusing. It says surface parking adjacent to a public sidewalk shall be screened by a landscaped buffer of sufficient width to allow the healthy establishment of trees, shrubs, and perennials, but no less than 6 feet. The buffer may also include, and here I was, but no less than 6 feet in width, in length, in depth.
I'm gonna say no less than 6 feet. In, you could say either width or depth.
I think I would go for width myself.
And then it goes on.
Actually, wait a second. I just changed my mind, depth, because somebody could take width to mean, well, as long as it runs for 6 whole feet along the sidewalk, whereas depth, although a little funky, is perfectly clear what it means.
Then it goes on to say the buffer may also include a fence or wall of no more than 3 feet in height. Then it goes on to say no fence or wall is needed if there's an existing grade change between the parking and the sidewalk. It doesn't say, I mean, here you're saying a fence, you have an option to include a fence, but then you're going on to say you don't need a fence if you have a grade change. And that it didn't make sense to me that to say.
It should say no buffer is needed if there is an existing grade change. At least that would be the intent. But do we really, well, it says that achieves the same desired separation. But is the desired separation for the purpose of, what is the purpose? Is it
So I'm gonna
visual,
probably,
auditory, or keeping people from stepping into a parked car or a moving car?
so I'm probably gonna say, because within the rules and regs, there's the ability for the planning board to waive requirements. And I'm gonna probably suggest just deleting this last sentence. If there does come forward a project where there is a significant separation between, the sidewalks up here and, it slopes down and parking's down here, and then the board can waive the requirement for 6 feet of landscaping. But you are correct that the requirement for a fence is a may, and this assumes that it is a shall. So I do see the confusion, but
Okay, I'm happy to delete it. I think it's more straightforward.
That makes sense to me too.
And then my last question is under 5.7.d. And here it talks about shared outdoor space. Multifamily housing shall have common outdoor space that all residents can access. Such space may be in any combination of X, Y, and Z. All outdoor space, active and passive, shall count toward the project's minimum open space requirement. And then I didn't know. Okay, that's what I didn't know where it was.
and that's gonna be 7. 11.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, that's all I had.
All right. Sue,
I have one small thing, which is, I can't remember, Elizabeth, if I heard you correctly in our last planning board meeting. Did you say that we're not actually required to have a public hearing to adopt these guidelines? Excuse me, site plan rules and regs?
correct.
Well, in section 1.5, under amendment, we say that we shall have a public hearing. And so if we aren't required to have a public hearing to adopt them, should we write it into this that required to have a public hearing to amend them? And, you know, we could have a public hearing even if we're not required to, but I just wonder, why would we write it into it for amendments, whereas it isn't in for the original adoption? I could see going either way on this, though, if other people have other opinions.
It's entirely up to the board. I mean, we did send, we did advertise the adoption of these regulations, as a public hearing and put a legal notice in the paper. And then it was after that town council informed us that there is no requirement for adoption of site plan or MBTA community site plan rules and regs. But, whether the board wishes to keep that in there for public notice or, that's entirely up to the board.
If we
You're
don't have to
muted,
have,
Linda.
if we don't have to have a public hearing, we probably shouldn't have one.
Well, I can see how we could have one even if it's not required. I'm just wondering why
Why
we
would you want
would-
to do that?
why
would
we would write it into this. I mean, maybe there would be some reason where we would decide on the spot, oh, let's do it, but it seems odd to write it in and make it a requirement.
I agree. I think if it's not required, it shouldn't be in there.
Right.
I think that's what you're saying, right? I think that's what everyone's saying. It's basically, there's no point in putting a technical requirement where it's not otherwise necessary, because it's just going to cause a potential issue.
Linda, you're muted.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Sorry about that.
No, you guys haven't had a virtual meeting in a while. You're all out of practice, that's
Right.
all.
Right. The only counter to that is that MBTA communities, it is a little different. And because it's a state mandate and the state is going to take a look at these rules and regs. And maybe it would be prudent in some regard to say, okay, we're not going to go and change these and change all our hopes to shalls or whatever behind anyone's back. That's my only thought. But
Well,
the-
I would kind of say that the state comes back and says, oh, there's serious problems with your site plan rules and regs, that might be a good reason to have a public hearing on a major amendment. But if we leave it the way it was originally, then if the state says, yeah, it's fine, and one day we want to amend one word, we have to have a public hearing.
that's true. Okay. I think that makes sense to me. Yeah. Then we don't have to go through. We can have the Sue Felshins of the future do all their editing at will.
Speaking of which, I see some formatting issues on the screen before me, but Elizabeth, I'm going to guess that will get cleaned up when this turns into the actual final version.
Formatting issues where?
Well, I see bullets and
No,
numbers.
those are,
And the indentation is weird. How come it's 1.4 waivers and then the text of the paragraph is indented? And how come
okay.
1.2 is indented different from 1.3, but 1.1 is just perfect? But that level of thing.
I will make sure all of the indents are correct, but no, the dots you see, just identify
Sure, got
Um,
it. Okay,
something, but, I'll turn it off so that, Andrew, I did want to, just recognize that Pat Nelson has joined the meeting.
Thank you.
Can I ask,
Yes.
can I ask a quick question? And maybe you covered this when I wasn't at the meeting, and I apologize if that's the case. Under 5.8B, outdoor lighting shall use 2200 K or warmer fixtures. I thought 3000 was sort of the number.
okay, I can speak to that. So I, in the last 6 months, came across an article that said that the International Dark Sky Association, which has renamed themselves to something slightly different lately, has moved to a standard of 2200 K. Now, since I gave back comments on this article, I've been trying to actually find a citation on the International Dark Sky Association, whatever they're called now, website that proves that 2200 K number. And I haven't found it yet. And I have a draft email to them to say, well, where is that? And a draft email to MIT Technology Review magazine to say, well, you talked to these people, you quoted them directly. Where did you get that information? And I haven't done it yet. I'm sorry.
Okay, I just, HDC and other
Yeah.
commissions I've on uses 3000. That's why.
I
And
know, and I have draft emails to them too, to say you
Right.
should lower it to 2200, only I'm waiting on getting absolute confirmation of that number before I contact them.
Well, we don't want to make it onerous. That's all. I mean,
So
Yeah,
I'm with the previous change you just made, I'm probably gonna suggest that we, change this to 3,000, so it's consistent with natural resources and HDC. And, I can, and so once Sue does get the information, then we, the planning board can, put forth to natural resources and HDC that information and have
CBA.
a coordinated approach.
Yeah.
Because then you would just have to change this at a regularly scheduled meeting, to reduce it and not a public hearing. So that would be my recommendation.
okay.
okay.
I see thumbs up, so I'm gonna take it.
What we don't want is 4000 and numbers like
Right.
that. That's where it looks like it's fluorescent lighting. Okay.
Anything
Thanks.
else, Mark?
No, that's it. Thank you.
Sue, other than formatting?
I think it was just that one comment about 1.5 that we took care of.
Okay. And then I did forward, the board comments that I did receive, from, one of your local developers, Matt Seppi, who I know is on. I don't know if he wants to go through his comments or not. Don't want to put him on the spot, but I can go through them, since the board did, receive that email. And then you also received another, public comment email from, Carol Savoy, that I think the board does need to, discuss, what she, brought up. So, if you want me to continue on, Andrew?
Yeah.
The first question, unless Matt, you want to ask your questions?
No, I was just gonna indicate if you felt they were applicable at all for the board to consider. I mean, I just had those 4 items I sent over in the email. And that was really the only feedback that I had. And I think one of them already has been touched on about the open space question.
Yep, so, so the 4 questions, just a recap for the board. Matt had a question about, just to clarify about, the zoning and the adoption of MBTA community zoning and even these rules and regs, does not, mandate any community, provide additional infrastructure to support the development of housing under the MBTA communities law or, the zoning that was adopted. Additionally, the question had to deal with setbacks for parking. The zoning that was adopted and even, the current zoning bylaw for, residential, single family dwellings, does not have a requirement, setback requirement for parking. But within your rules and regulations, as you saw, there is a requirement for landscaping. But and additionally, elsewhere in your rules and regs, it talks about the open space requirement, which under the zoning is 20%. And then Matt's fourth question dealt with, in the rules and regs, it under the sustainability section, it encourages electrification and no fossil fuels. But the town also has adopted a general bylaw, the fossil fuel free, general bylaw and adoption of the specialized stretch code. One's a zoning, this is a zoning bylaw and your rules and regs. The other is a general bylaw. So it doesn't, these rules and regs in the zoning does not supersede or the general bylaw that was adopted. So I think, while it's in the rules and regs, and I can bring it up. It was letter D. So I don't know if you're, I think you're still seeing my screen, right?
Yep.
Right.
So letter D talks about reduce or eliminate the use of fossil fuels for building conditioning and operation in favor of building electrification and passive design strategies.
And there should be a period at the end of that sentence.
I guess the question is, if you had, a large home that you were separating into and making it into a multifamily,
Right.
would you then have, and say you had a gas furnace, would you have to then?
I don't believe so. The fossil fuel free general bylaw deals with new construction. It would not, it does not kick in for, renovations or remodels, and so I don't believe. So
So
I
I
think
would-
that's a good point about keeping this in.
But contrary-wise, what if there was a federal law making it illegal to ban fossil fuel installations? We would still have 5.13.d.
So I think it should, remain. I just wanted to clarify that, these rules and regs do not supersede or invalidate that general bylaw.
Okay.
So that was it for,
So for the utilities, was the suggestion that we eliminate that whole section that
no,
talks?
it was just a question.
Okay,
That just, Matt was just clarifying that the MBTA community zoning does not mandate towns have
Right.
to upgrade infrastructure, and that is a correct statement. It does not.
Right.
So, and then Andrew, I don't know if you want me to bring up Carol's email. Would that be helpful?
Yeah, I think it would.
Okay, so first I have to figure out how to
Sorry.
stop sharing. Okay, so she's specifically speaking to the section, the purpose and goals. to ensure that potential negative impacts such as glare, noise, and odors are reduced through landscaping or other measures. And so she's recommending, so under section 5.8, currently it talks about fencing, plantings, or a combination of both an appropriate siding shall screen mechanical equipment. And she's recommending, I believe, including roof decks, terraces, balconies, open spaces, to mitigate. So there's one for mechanicals, and then there's one for roof decks, terraces, and balconies. So I think what I have to do is stop sharing again. Okay, so at this point, you still see the rules and regs, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So the first comment she had, talking about, so 1.1. So this is the purpose and goals section she's referencing, and then going down to 5.8. 5.8. Open space, no, 5.8. Mechanical. So right here, fencing, plantings, or a combination of both, and appropriate siding shall screen mechanical equipment to mitigate the visual and auditory impact of equipment, which is already there. So
It's in slightly different language. I'm finding a little bit hard to follow which are suggestions she's making and which are highlighting of existing language, but I think she's suggesting that all mechanicals, whether at ground level or roof level or any other level, shall be screened to mitigate both visual and auditory impact, whereas at the moment it says that ground level shall be screened for noise and rooftop shall be screened for vision from a public right of way. I remember we discussed this at our previous meeting and left it as currently drafted.
yeah, so
Well, it's just saying mechanicals in general. It doesn't say,
Oh, you're right. I was looking at the old draft. I'm getting mixed
Yeah.
up between what the shared screen and the previous version I was looking at. So I'm not.
So her comment, glare, noise, and odors are generally mentioned under purpose and goals in section 1.1. However, some buildings may have roof decks, terraces, and balconies for each unit. This section does not specifically discuss glare, noise, and odors that may come from roof decks, balconies, terraces, or other outdoor spaces. Suggest the planning board add something similar to 5.8, such as roof decks, terraces, balconies, open space shall have fencing, plantings, or a combination of both, and appropriate siding shall screen roof decks, terraces, balconies to mitigate the visual, odors, and auditory impact of roof decks, terraces, and balconies.
Okay, but she's suggesting making that change in 5.7 buildings. Item D. So you have to scroll up a hair.
Well, item
There.
D deals with well, so item D talks about the shared spaces and that you can have rooftops and terraces. So I think what she's looking for is something along this measure.
Right, that does seem like what she's suggesting. I would suggest not adding this. It seems like an onerous requirement on residents. I mean, right now, I can have a cookout on my terrace balcony or open space anywhere in my yard.
Not,
And
not according to the fire department, I don't think.
well, okay, maybe not a cookout, but a picnic certainly and it can have noise and odors to a much greater degree. And I wouldn't want us to constrain multifamilies more than we constrain single families in this particular respect. Particularly given the long history that some people may not know about of using that as a way to keep out new kinds of people.
Well, it would make the MBTA communities have different requirements than any other multifamily structure. So
Right, that too.
I think it, and I don't see that it's practical to screen terraces or balconies. You know, and mechanicals on a roof would be screened. And an auditory is part of that screening. So I agree with you. I just don't see that it's practical or equitable
Yeah,
to
I
MBTA.
I
I'm
would
sorry.
agree just because screening screening for odors on a balcony, like what does that even entail or mean? I understand. I think the initial concern about odors was related to, restaurants and things like that adjacent or abutting residential properties. And so I understand that that's like a separate concern, but I think the fact that we already have language related to the screening of mechanicals, that seems completely adequate. We ask for screening of mechanicals in other instances in town. Certainly HDC does. Screening mechanicals, I don't have any issue with. This screening of other open spaces seems like an overreach, and also just practically speaking, how would somebody accomplish some of that? If you have the visual impact of a balcony that was screened for auditory with sound paneling on it is going to have more of a visual impact than something that's unscreened. We just start kind of overcomplicating it at that point. So I would remove that. I would keep the language about the mechanicals. And this is something that, could be revisited down the road if this becomes a major issue. But as of right now, I think it's solving a problem that I don't anticipate incurring, given that we already addressed mechanicals.
Um,
I'm just going to weigh in that I agree. This seems like overreach to me. And it does seem like something that we'd be requiring for the MBTA communities that we wouldn't be requiring for other people, and that's not allowed. Correct? Am I correct in that?
Correct.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Great. So I guess with that, because we opened a public hearing, do we need to vote and close a public hearing? In order to make
Procedurally,
it-
that would be great.
Yeah, so with that, I will do a
Unless you want to
executive
take,
motion.
ask for any other public comment.
Thank you. We discussed the one public comment received in writing. Are there any other, or the 2 or 3 public comments received in writing? Are there any other public comments right now? I see we do have a hand up. Zeratias?
Hi, I just want to say that it seems like the document's really moving in the right direction. And I think it should contribute to producing more thoughtful development in the community. It touches on a lot of the things that I think are important in execution and potentially the public's exposure to this type of development. So I just think it's from a developer's perspective as well. It also just seemed like a pretty clear roadmap to follow and to think about in the development phase of the process. So that's just my feedback today. Certainly something I'm interested in. So just general feedback seems, I want you to know, it seems positive and moving in the right direction.
Can we get your name and address, please? Sorry.
Zor Atias, 29 Lexington Road.
Thank you. Linda?
I just wanted to thank the developers for commenting on this. It's refreshing and it's I think very supportive of the planning board to have a dialogue and have this kind of input. So thank you all very much.
Great. And so seeing no other public comments, I guess we need a vote to close the public hearing.
I move to close the public hearing on the MBTA community site plan rules and regulations.
Great. Do we have a second?
I'll second it.
Awesome. And we'll do a roll call vote for that because we are remote. In the order I see people, Rob Almeida,
Yes.
Mark Giddings,
Aye.
Linda Miller,
Yes.
Abby Flanagan,
Aye.
Sue Felshin,
Aye.
Pat Nelson,
Yes.
and I, Andrew Boardman, also a yes. And then with that, I'll need a motion for adoption of the site plan rules and regs pending.
As amended
As
this
amended.
evening and the formatting corrections made.
So do we have a motion for that?
Let's not always see the same hands. I move to adopt the MBTA community site plan rules and regulations as amended at tonight's meeting.
Great. And do we have a second?
And with formatting correction.
Awesome. Thank you. And with that, I will do another roll call vote on that motion. Probably in the same order because I don't think anyone's moved. Rob Almeida,
Yes.
Mark Giddings,
Yes.
Linda Miller,
Yes.
Abby Flanagan,
Aye.
Sue Felshin,
Aye.
Pat Nelson,
Yes.
and I, Andrew Boardman, am also an aye. And I see that Elizabeth has her hands up, which means I probably screwed something.
No. Oh, gosh, no. What I do would like to ask the board is just underneath the table of contents, I would like to just put a thanks to Innes Associates and Emily Innes and her team for assisting the town in putting together these regulations.
It's that customary? It says already prepared by Innes Associates.
So that because that was a draft that will come out, and the actual it will actually say final MBTA community site plan rules and regulations, and it will have the date. So that comes out because these are now your regulations that you're adopting. So that's why I would like to just put a note of thanks under the table of contents.
And I mean, I am grateful, but is it customary to thank or to acknowledge?
Acknowledge is fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sounds good.
Great. And with that, we will move on to the next agenda item, which is the 300-310 Baker Avenue recommendation of the ZBA.
So I'm gonna turn this over to Kevin Hurley, I believe, who's here with his consultant team.
Good evening. My name is Kevin Hurley. I live at 25 Lang Street. I'm a land planner and I'm representing Taurus Investment Holders and CD 211 Properties, and they are the owners of the 300-310 Baker Avenue property. With me this evening and speaking after me is Dan Feeney, a civil engineer with Bills and Thomas. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the project and then discuss the parking relief and joint parking that's part of the application. And Dan will go over the floodplain and the site plan aspects of the project. In addition, I just also want to mention to the board that we applied to the Natural Resources Commission for approval of the work within the floodplain. The Natural Resources Commission approved that work at their last meeting on December the 11th and has issued a draft order of conditions. They will finalize that order of conditions at their next meeting on January the 8th, assuming that all of the questions that have been raised by the town's peer engineer has been resolved. Tonight, we're looking for the planning board to make recommendations to the Board of Appeals regarding the floodplain aspect, regarding relief from the parking requirements, some proposed joint parking, and for site plan review. The property consists of 65 acres, and the 65 acres are zoned industrial park. Taurus, Dan, not that drawing just yet. If you could just go to your plan C21, or Elizabeth, did you put up that plan? Thanks, Dan. So there's 65 acres, it's zoned industrial park. Taurus is planning to divide the property into two lots. One would be Lot A. It will contain 55 acres and the existing office building. The existing office building will have about 400,000 square feet in it after it's modified in accordance with the current application. And Lot B will consist of 10 acres and contain the 201 units that the town approved as a 40B project in April of 24. This particular slide shows some of the work that's being proposed now at the office building, which is the only work that we're proposing this evening. As part of the work at the office building, we're proposing to demolish a 60 by 90 foot area. Dan's running his arrow around that area right now. It's a two-story portion of the existing office building. It contains approximately 11,400 square feet. And once that portion of the building is removed, we propose to develop 54 parking spaces in that location. And those 54 parking spaces are pretty much surrounded by the beige area, which is walkways, and there's an arrow going around those 54 parking spaces right now. Other site improvements, to the right of that, you'll see an area that's labeled or encircled in a black line where the road in from Baker Avenue Extension hits the main driveway that runs parallel to 300 Baker Avenue. And we're changing that intersection right here. And we're changing that intersection because right now it's 48 feet wide and it's pretty dangerous because cars in a 48-foot wide intersection drift all over the place. And we're going to narrow it down to 24 feet. We're also adding, both in this location and in the 54 space parking lot, additional car charging stations, and we're relocating some of the HP parking. So in the 54 spaces up near the front entrance. There'll be 2 handicap parking spaces. And then could we go to sheet C22? The only other work that we're proposing on this site is shown in a limited work area, and there's no handicap parking space at the back of the existing building. So we're proposing to relocate 2 handicap parking spaces back there, in part because there's a ramp that goes up to the restaurant, and the entrance to the restaurant is just above the words Lot A. There's 2 parallel gray areas. The right one is a handicap ramp. So we're looking to put some handicap parking back there. Dan, if you could go to the Vanessa Hagen Breslin yellow plan. So in June of 23, Taurus retained VHB. They are civil engineers that specialize in traffic studies. And we asked them to do an analysis of the area shown in yellow. On the right-hand end of the yellow area, there's a pond and the railroad right-of-way. In the middle, at the lower, you can see the outline of the 400,000 square foot building. And up on the left at the end is where the Marriott Hotel is. Shown in yellow, including the Marriott Hotel property, there's 1,591 parking spaces. 1,361 of those are on the property that is owned by Taurus and the CD 210 property. Of the 1,361 spaces on that property, and Dan, if we could go to the next slide shown in red. So this is another plan by VHB. The area that, or parking spaces that are shown in red are occupied parking spaces. The parking spaces that are shown in white are vacant parking spaces. And on June 13th of 23, on the 1,361 parking spaces that are owned by Taurus, there was 559 spaces occupied, and there was 802 parking spaces that were vacant. Because this study was done in June of 23, and we were filing a new application with the Board of Appeals this fall, my company redid a check of the Vanessa Hagen parking calculations, and we actually found that on September the 10th of 24, there was 5% more vacant parking spaces on the land owned by Taurus. Now, we're going away for a minute from what's existing to what's required for the Taurus property under the zoning bylaw. And that takes us back to 2016 when John Minty, previous building commissioner for the town, established a formula for calculating the parking on this property. And based on that formula, if you use the same approach that was used back then and look at the existing use, this property to conform with zoning requires 1,486 parking spaces. What we've proposed in our application before the Board of Appeals is 1,304 parking spaces, which is 182 parking spaces short of what's required by the zoning bylaw. And we've asked the Board of Appeals to waive that requirement for 182 parking spaces. And we have also shown in our application that based upon the 802 parking spaces that were vacant during the survey, if you subtract all the parking spaces that are going to be on Lot B and part of the Novo residential use, and subtract the spaces that are required to transition between Lot A and Lot B that will be lost, as well as the parking spaces that will be lost when we develop the 54 parking spaces, and add in current parking that's been authorized through joint parking agreements with the hotel, there will still be, in our opinion, 360 vacant parking spaces, and that's not including the 54 proposed parking spaces or other parking spaces. So we'll have an excess of parking, and we believe that it's a good idea to build the 54 parking spaces where they're proposed. Then if we could go back to the sheet C21. So the new parking spaces would be in the area to the left front corner of the building. They will, when we've done parking counts on the land that will be dedicated to Lot B and part of the residential use, we've never counted more than 60 parking spaces. These 54 will replace that 60. In addition, by providing these 54 parking spaces at this location, which is the most densely used area on the site for parking, we will free up adjacent parking spaces. And we've made an application, or as part of our application, we're proposing that Lot A, the office building, would be enabled to use 21 parking spaces on Lot B, the residential use, during normal business hours, Monday through Friday, and that during non-business hours, Monday through Friday, the residential use will be able to use 40 of the office space parking spaces. And on Saturday, Sunday, and any holiday, the residential property will be allowed to use 40 parking spaces at any time during those particular days. That's a quick overview. I'd be glad to answer questions, but I'd also like Dan Feeney at this point just to talk about the floodplain issues and any other site plan aspects he feels it's appropriate to add. Dan?
Thanks, Kevin. So we had initially done a layout and grading based on an assumed groundwater elevation out here. And groundwater is important because we are increasing the impervious area slightly associated with this. You know, we're taking down a portion of the building, as Kevin noted, but the parking is in an area of both the building footprint that's being demolished, as well as a grass courtyard area in here. So, and the reason why we hadn't done test pits right away was just due to the number of utilities that are in this area, and trying to be a little bit cautious out there. And so we were originally proposing grades that were a little bit higher, and it would cause some fill in the floodplain. And we had, as part of the Novo Riverside project, overcompensated for the floodplain, and we were hoping to use some of that excess storage capacity from that. But as we got into the project, we decided it was better to go back out there and do a couple of test pits. So we did that, and it was witnessed by the assistant town engineer. And groundwater was a little bit lower than we had assumed, the seasonal high groundwater, you know, using DEP soil methodology to determine the estimated seasonal high groundwater. So based on that, we did revise the plans, and we were able to lower the site grades a little bit, such that now there is essentially, based on the design grades, we're providing no fill within the floodplain. It's a net balance throughout this area. And I should note that we're in the upper sections of the floodplain here. Based on the datum that we're using on this site, the floodplain's at elevation 124.7. And most of this area is up around 124-ish. And it has to actually overtop under existing conditions the sidewalk that runs along the front here. So it has to come over 124 to fill into this area. So we're only talking about work within the upper, 0.7 feet of the floodplain. But again, by being able to raise the site, we are proposing some subsurface infiltration here. That mitigates peak rates of runoff as runoff volumes associated with the increased impervious area. And we are still proposing a small amount of floodplain compensation, approximately 13 cubic yards worth of floodplain compensation. And that's for, you can get slight deviations in the constructed as-built grades when a project's built. And even if you're off by, a tenth of a foot here or there, an inch or so here and there, it will start to add up to a few cubic yards. So we wanted to just make sure that we had some flexibility as we move forward with the construction. So basically we're providing 13 cubic yards of floodplain compensation, even though we're not proposing any net floodplain fill associated with this parking lot. That's the floodplain impacts of this project. Again, they're pretty minor. Again, this is a higher section of the site. A lot of the site, if you go ahead to the north of the building, we have grades down there of about 122, 122.5. So that's, a couple of feet into the floodplain. This area is just in the upper reaches of the floodplain. In terms of stormwater, we are collecting the stormwater and discharging it to a shallow depth subsurface infiltration system to stay above that, 2 feet minimum above the groundwater elevation out here. So all the runoff from the area that's tributary to these subsurface infiltrations, which is the majority of this parking lot, will be directed into there and will infiltrate. We do have good soils on site, hydrologic group A soils. There is a small section of the parking lot that will drain to a rain garden. And then there is emergency overflow from the subsurface infiltration system and an overflow from the rain garden that will tie into the existing drainage infrastructure that exists on site. So that's sort of, an overview of the floodplain and stormwater. As Kevin had noted, we will have some handicap parking up front near the building. It's a flush curb in this area, so there's a barrier-free access to a new doorway into the building. And that's our overview. I'm happy to answer any questions.
I actually have a little question about that part. You said that the groundwater level was a little bit lower than you expected when you surveyed it. Was that, when was that done? Because we did have a major drought for a portion of this year.
Yeah, so the groundwater elevation was probably about a month or so ago. But we're not logging where groundwater actually is. We're logging where soil modeling is occurring in the test pit. So it's where groundwater comes up to at its highest point during the course of a typical year. Because that.
Okay, thank you. Based on the character of the soil. Got it.
I do have a question. Just given that this is a very large parking area, is anything that you're planning to do potential in terms of mitigating heat islands?
And mitigating, you mean landscaping the islands?
No, the heat island effect of having so much asphalt pavement absorbing sun, which can be mitigated through pervious pavement or light colored pavement or tree plantings or solar canopies or many other methods.
So Dan, why don't you bring up sheet L1? So this sheet shows, to a large extent, existing islands and existing vegetation, and we're continuing that around the 54 parking spaces that are being proposed. And this is typical of what you find on the entire site in terms of islands and plantings.
Okay, so this, I can't really, so the existing, where it says the existing second floor roof patio, so it's that area just lower than that, that's the area we're talking about?
Correct. So
Okay.
what I consider perhaps to be the slightly darker colored trees where the indicator is right now and on one of those islands, those are proposed trees. The brighter color green are existing trees.
Are any trees proposed to be removed?
I believe the answer to that is no. There might be a couple of shrubs, but no trees.
Okay, so all those sort of mottled olive trees are new, absolute new trees.
Correct.
So Kevin, can I ask what may be a dumb question? Why are you doing this? What's the purpose?
At one point, we had proposed building a parking garage on
I
the
knew
upper
that. Right, right.
And that was in large part to try and influence the retention of Welch's Grape. And Welch's Grape occupies an 84,000 square foot portion
Right.
of the existing building. They have since made the decision to move to Waltham.
Right.
Their lease ends in July of 25. And we were looking at the parking garage, and particularly when we were before the Board of Appeals for the residential, you can see the building at 292 just on the left-hand side of this sheet.
Right.
The Board of Appeals had concerns about all of the buildings because of the massing. So we were looking for a way to get away from the parking garage that created a great deal of massing. It's kind of interesting. The parking garage, I'm just looking for my numbers, contained 386 parking spaces. But in order to build the parking garage, we had to eliminate 151 existing parking spaces. So we only gained 235. As I mentioned earlier, the most intensive use for parking is in this portion of the site. And that's why we want to build the 54 parking spaces. We want to build it so the office building has them during normal business hours, and the residential use will have them during not normal
Right.
business hours. So when Novo, the residential use, was approved, we had 284 parking spaces approved, which is a ratio of 1.4 spaces per unit. We're also proposing joint parking where Novo will be able to use some of the office or the parking that'll be on Lot A. They'll be able to use up to 40 parking spaces. When you add 40 additional parking spaces to what's going to be built for Novo, you get a total of 324, but you bring the ratio up to 1.6 spaces for the residential use. So overall, we think it adds to a good balance. In the satellite areas, the easternmost point of the parking that Lot A will have and the northwesternmost point of the parking lot, it's not very likely that at least approximately 500 of those spaces will not be used.
Right.
And perhaps at a future date, when the residential use is up and fully occupied, we may come back and discuss removing some of those parking spaces.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get that. Was the 40 spaces for use by the proposed use by the residents at any time, and then additional ones to be used nights, weekends, and holidays? Or was that 40 of the spaces were proposed to be available to residents nights, weekends, and holidays, period?
So the 40 spaces would be available, as you indicated, in the evening from 5 o'clock in the evening to 8 a.m. in the morning during Monday to Friday and non-holidays. That on Saturday, Sunday, and holidays, those spaces would be available for the residents to use at any hour.
Right, night, weekends, and holidays, but just the 40 spaces. However, that is exactly when residents would be expected to need them the most.
Correct.
So Kevin, was that 40 spaces required for approval on the residential project?
No, although the
I didn't
Board of
think so.
Appeals-
Yeah.
The Board of Appeals did know that we were going to consider that.
Okay.
There was
But
nothing.
there was no contingency for it. Okay.
Right, so nothing in the comprehensive permit that
Yep.
requires it.
And is there a written joint agreement with the current project and the residents in?
There is a written joint agreement between the residence inn and the tourist or the CD to
Right.
a
Yeah,
property.
yeah. Okay. And is that on file someplace I could look at it, Kevin?
Yes, it was approved by the town planner and has subsequently been recorded at the Registry of Deeds.
Okay.
It provides that Lot A or all of the Taurus property has the exclusive right to use 83 parking spaces that are on the land owned by the hotel. And then they have a joint parking agreement with the hotel for an additional 92 spaces.
Thanks.
I suspect that's also in the file at the building
Yeah,
department.
joint parking, the whole parking thing, Kevin, is an issue. That's why I was curious. It had nothing to do with this, but thank you.
I think one of the biggest things here is that tenants that occupy large office spaces, 40, 50, 60, 80,000 square feet, do not use their space as intensely as somebody that's occupying 2, 4, or 6,000 square feet. And that's why you see a large discrepancy between what's required by the zoning bylaw and what's actually used in an existing condition. And here we have an existing building, so we've had the benefit of being able to study the parking use as opposed to proposing a large building and perhaps being less accurate in terms of to what degree the existing parking is going to be used.
Right.
Well, that's sort of true, but with Welch's moving out, for all we know, you might end up breaking up their large building into multiple smaller ones, which then might utilize the parking more, but who knows?
Yeah.
I would like to throw something out here that may or may not have bearing on this, which is we all hope and trust that we will get our pedestrian walkway to West Concord in a suitable amount of time for the benefit of everybody. That you have plenty of extra parking here, and it would make a lot of sense for you to allocate some of it for paid use by users of the Bruce Green Rail Trail or just general parking in West Concord Center, where parking is at somewhat of a premium, but on the other hand, people might not want to walk that far, although they would if they were going to the rail trail. Or the town might want to attempt, if you were willing to purchase some land using our amazingly well-funded parking fund, for public parking. And I would hate to see well-located parking get removed now before we have a chance to see what happens after your residential project goes in and the walkway goes through. But again, that doesn't have exact bearing on what you're proposing to do here, but I want us all to keep in mind that we should be thinking about that future already.
Yeah, and keep in mind that at this point in time, we're not proposing to eliminate any what we believe to be surplus parking. We believe that at the end of the day, there'll be in excess of 500 vacant parking spaces. If that turns out to be true, once the residential is fully occupied, then we can't remove the parking even if we want to without approval from the town. So we'd come and discuss that and we'd see whether it makes sense for any of that parking to be a public resource. Currently, some of the vacant parking, particularly where a second residential building or the residential building closest to the river goes, we call it 294 Baker Avenue. The fire department conducts extensive training there because they can operate their equipment. We have two other areas where the fire department can continue to operate training-wise, and they will not interfere with the residential use or the office use. So it'll just be something that we need to look towards in the future. We have committed, and we agree with your earlier statement that we'd love to see the trail built we've committed to build 1,200 feet of it as part of this project. We've also agreed to grant an easement from Baker Ave to the river. And of course, the nature of that easement will be discussed down the road when the town knows more exactly what is needed. Unfortunately, the parking on the residential is likely to be very tight. We'll have to look at it again when it's fully occupied. But if it turns out that some of that residential parking could be freed up, even a couple of parking spaces for the public near the trail would be helpful.
It certainly would, and even if it had to be a little further away because that was the only available, it would be helpful. But again, as you say, that is something to be seen later, and you're not proposing to remove parking now.
No, we will remove parking to build the residential, and we'll remove a couple of parking spaces to make transitions between Lot A and Lot B. But the over 500 that we project to be vacant long-term, we will keep until the Novo apartments are fully occupied and we see what the impact is going to be going forward based upon that occupancy. We've also held in these numbers, held aside 135 of the currently vacant parking spaces, and that 135 spaces is being set aside for space that is currently vacant in the existing office building. So when it's occupied, obviously those tenants will use the 135.
Great. Is there any other comments or questions from the planning board at this time? Seeing none, I would open it up for questions from the public at this. If there are. Great. So with that, I believe our next step, Elizabeth,
You go before the Board of Appeals on the 9th of January. And my understanding is your next meeting is on the 7th of January. And hopefully by the 7th of January, the board could draft a recommendation to the Board of Appeals and vote on it at the 7th, and so that it would be available for the Board of Appeals on the 9th.
If that's the direction of the board, I would be happy to do that.
At this
Have we
point,
gotten the documentation that we need, all the parking studies that he talked about, and
Yep.
and the town
So-
engineer has looked at the levels of the land?
Yeah, so the building commissioner has reviewed all of the parking analysis, and he does agree with all of the parking analysis that have been provided with the application. I do know that the town's outside consultant reviewing the site, utilities, stormwater drainage, and floodplain, Dan Feeney is collaborating with them on addressing the issues and concerns that they raised in their letter, and I imagine that will happen prior to January 7th.
Okay.
And so that any other outstanding issues regarding stormwater drainage, utilities, and the floodplain will be addressed. So
Okay.
the only other comments that have been raised is the fire department will be requiring that prior to any site work, all of the hydrants on site be tested. And that's consistent with a condition for the Novo project. And then other than that, there have been no other issues or concerns that have been raised.
Okay, thank you.
Just one question. I'm sorry, I haven't gone through all of the documentation, but can you tell us the before and after amount of impervious surfaces?
Dan Feeney, can you tell us what the increase in impervious surface on lot A will be and what the current impervious surface on lot A is?
It's approximately a 10,000 square foot increase in impervious area. And I don't have the exact number. I could, give me 1 second. I might be able to, find it on the plans. I would estimate that there's probably close to around 20 acres of impervious, currently, so it's a relatively small percentage increase in the impervious area.
Oh, that includes the whole all the buildings and everything. I was just thinking in terms of parking, but
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't have the number, but generally you get about 110 to 20 parking spaces per acre. You know, so, you know, if the current parking on the lot A now, Kevin, what did you say that was? Because I know
It's
there's some shared agreement,
1,361.
so it's probably 10 to 12 acres of parking areas.
So, Dan, on the plan that you have, which is PL, it's called the lotting plan. I think you had that so you could bring it up this evening. That does indicate the paving on lot A and on lot B.
Yeah, it's got the lot maximum lot coverage is 50% by zoning, and it's about 28.6 acres. I'm sorry, 28.6% on lot B, which is the 40B locus. So for lot A, it's about 25%, of which 9.7% is building. So it's about 15% impervious, and lot A is going to be 55 acres.
Correct.
okay, I'll have to focus a little bit more on the numbers, but yeah.
Yeah,
I
But
just-
the bottom line is that Natural Resources signed off on the increase in impervious, correct?
Correct.
that's correct. Yeah, and you know, we do have a pretty
That's their
good
purview.
size subsurface infiltration system for the small amount, that 10,000 square foot of additional impervious, such that even during 100-year storm, all the flow that goes to it stays in it. I mean, we have an emergency overflow, but it's self-contained, that parking lot in there. Other than the stuff that gets to the rain garden, there is some discharge from the rain garden, but that's only a small portion of that. So we're meeting peak runoff rates as well as runoff volumes, which easy to meet runoff rates. The volumes is usually a little bit tricky. But between having a decent sized infiltration system as well as having the A soils out there, the really sandy soils, allows us to really recharge that groundwater.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We need a continuance, is that what we need?
Go ahead, Mark.
So yes, if the board would, you know, unless there's any other issues and concerns, providing that the concerns raised in the outside consultant's letter get addressed. If the board wishes, they can continue discussion to your January 7th meeting and provide me direction on whether you want me to draft a positive recommendation or not.
I think at this point, drafting a positive recommendations is the right choice. I haven't heard anybody voicing a strong opinion about whether or not they oppose. It's the simple answer.
Well, I think we need the conditions from the other groups, right, Elizabeth? I mean,
So
before-
there will definitely be standard conditions that get incorporated into any
Right.
Site plan project, any construction project, especially when you're dealing with parking. There'll, the standard conditions regarding lighting, stormwater drainage. There'll be standard floodplain conditions regarding the compensatory storage and before and after. There'll be the standard conditions from fire department and the pre-construction meeting, construction safety and sequencing, how that's going to be managed with the travel areas. So there will be all the standard conditions that you usually see for this type of project.
and should we wait for that before we move forward?
I don't think the board needs to wait.
Okay.
The only really outstanding issue, which I'm suspecting that Dan is gonna move forward with, is addressing those issues and concerns raised in the outside consultant's report,
Right.
which will generate a revised plan. But that revised plan will deal with stormwater and utilities. And, I don't expect to see any modification to the actual layout of the project.
Yeah, that's correct, Elizabeth. And we did, we got the comments last Wednesday and we did have a call with, the assistant town engineer as well as, the peer review consultant GPI on Friday. So we're making those, modifications this week to the stormwater. And it doesn't really involve floodplain. It's really stormwater, as well as the stormwater report. And we're gonna get that back over, the end of this week.
Okay. Yeah, I'm fine with it then, whatever you want to do.
So
Okay,
as,
I will move forward and start drafting a recommendation and put this on the agenda for your January 7th meeting.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
with that, we'll move on to administrative.
Mark.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Wait, did we actually do the part where we continued the hearing if we needed to, or didn't we need to?
So this is a recommendation to the Board of
Oh, you're
Appeals,
right,
it's
so we
not a
don't need
public
to.
hearing.
Right.
Thank you for trying to keep us honest, though. Appreciate it. So with that, we'll move on to administrative business. Public comment. Public comment is limited to up to 15 minutes with no more than 3 minutes allocated to any one speaker. Public comment is limited to items which are not on the agenda. Is there anyone from the public who has a comment? I will take that silence as a no and move on to planning board liaison, town planner updates.
I was not here for the past few days, so I don't have an update except my nephew graduated from Virginia Commonwealth University, so
Yeah.
yay. After beating cancer, so we're pretty proud of him, so.
Good for you.
The only item I have is that the Concord's Affordable Municipal Housing Trust meeting was delayed due to a Zoom issue. So it will be in January. And I will be Zoom.
And I do believe the date has been set for January. January 14th at 5 p.m.
You mean the housing roundtable,
The
right?
housing, yes, the housing roundtable.
Okay. And then the last item we have is the planning board minutes from December 3rd. I didn't have any comments. Did anyone else?
I looked at them, they're good.
Great. So do we have a motion to accept those minutes and we can vote on it?
I make a motion that we approve the minutes as submitted.
I'll second that.
Awesome. And roll call vote in the order I see you. Rob,
Yes,
Mark,
Yes.
Linda,
Yes,
Abby,
Yes.
Sue,
I,
and we seem to have lost Pat, but I, Andrew, am yes as well. And with that, that is the end of our organized agenda. So thank you all for coming and have a great night.